Welcome back to The Gaze. I'm Henry Key and this is my show, Talk for More. I am happy to meet you on a digital platform of a new Future Europe, a space where we find and highlight all of the most significant events in the region for you, and we'll speak about it with the best of experts. And I'm very glad to present today our guest, Mr. Cormac Smith. Mr. Cormac Smith is an expert in the field of government communications. He began his public relations career in the early 1990s and has enjoyed a successful and highly varied career in government, which spanned almost 2 decades. Also, Mr. Smith, LinkedIn puts it, he has the ability to understand complex organizations fast and to work in politically sensitive environments that has made you, dear sir, particularly valued to clients grappling with such wicked challenges as staff engagement, business transformation, and reputation management. Am I right, Mr. Smith? Did I miss anything?
Henry, that's a wonderful introduction. Thank you very much. The last part you said was something I've been very interested in all of my career, which is leadership. And, you know, when you're talking about changing, transformation or reforming or indeed engaging with staff in a large organization like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs when I worked for the Ukrainian government, leadership is what is really important. And, you know, leadership is what Ukraine is demonstrating to the world at the moment, from the President Volodymyr Zelensky down to every representative of the country, and of course, the great Ukrainian people.
Thank you very much from the bottom of my heart and from the bottom of the very nation of Ukraine. The European Union uses the civil protection mechanism to provide aid to Ukraine after Russia blasted the Kakhovka HPP dam. The first contributions were made by Germany, Austria and Lithuania. Germany offered 5,000 filters and 56 generators. Austria handed over 20 water tanks and 10 drilling pumps. In addition, Lithuania and Germany also offered the tents, the beds and blankets. The disaster occurred on the territory of Ukraine, but its consequences will surely have a negative impact on many countries. So it is world's problem now. Pollution of the Black Sea, climate change, food security, etc., etc. So my first question is to you as a communication expert. How would you, Mr. Smith, assess the actions of correspondent Ukrainian, of the old Ukrainian government and the correspondent institutions in terms of delivering the message to the world? What are the terrible consequences of this horrific catastrophe, terroristic act made by Russia?
Well, you know, Henry, the Ukrainian people and government are under the greatest pressure at the moment. They are suffering what is a genocidal war from a criminal government in the Kremlin, which wishes to wipe out Ukrainian identity. So to have to deal with this huge tragedy on both a human and an environmental scale for Ukraine in the middle of that war is just a massive challenge. And I think that's very clearly why Russia did this. Russia is a country that has, and you know, the Kremlin and Putin has no hesitation in murdering, you know, tens of thousands of innocent people. They have been doing this in Ukraine for the last 16 months, carrying out genocide, and we know that they have done this in Syria and before in Chechnya, where they virtually wiped whole cities off the face of the map, as unfortunately they have done with great cities like Mariupol in the last 16 months. So this has been a great challenge for Ukraine. I think from what I have seen, the Ukrainians have responded superbly to this. The communication has been very, very difficult, I think, because, of course, Russia, which lies on an industrial scale, immediately claimed that it was the Ukrainians themselves who blew up the dam. One, how could they possibly do that? And two, why would a country that fights to protect its own people inflict such a disaster? It has no credibility whatsoever.
A wonderful saying, an industrial scale of lies. Indeed, that's what Russia does. Reconstruction of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant will last for 5 years and will cost up $1-2 billion. It was stated by the General Director of Hydroelectric, Igor Sirota. It is next to impossible for us, the country at war, to find these resources for itself. The complete repair of this HPP will take place after the situation on the front stabilizes, after Ukraine defeats the enemy, said Alexei Kuleba, deputy head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, in a comment to Radio Liberty. We understand it is necessary to put as much pressure on Moscow as possible in order to do many things, make them like withdraw their troops from our land, in order to counter their propaganda, etc., etc. Is there a way to create such a pressure using a communication, again, tool, some technology? And is it possible after all?
Well, you know, before, I think at such a stage as the war is won, and that is, we are still a long way off that. There will be many, many hundreds of billions of dollars available for the reconstruction of Ukraine, not just for the dam, but for the dam in particular, because we can talk about this has a huge effect on the Ukrainian economy. It has been estimated that the destruction of this dam will reduce Ukrainian wheat and grain production by up to 10% in the coming years. It will, possibly it could turn the Crimean Peninsula, which Ukraine is determined to take back because Crimea is part of Ukraine. It has the potential to turn Crimea into a desert. So there is so much. So to get back to your question, first the war must be won. To win the war, that starts with the diplomatic efforts, but also the communication at every level, using television, using radio, using social media, using anywhere we can influence decision makers. But what I must say is, as much support as the West is giving, it is too little, and it is tending to come too late. We have finally, after 16 months this year, started to give Ukraine all of the heavy weapons that they have been crying out for from the start of this war. This is long-range artillery. We saw Britain give Storm Shadow, which is very important. Right. The battle tanks. We finally saw the Germans agree to release the Leopard tanks, which Ukraine has been asking for. And again, I have got to say, Great Britain has played a huge role in unlocking that logjam with the donation earlier this year, initially of 14 of our Challenger tanks. And the Americans are also giving a small number, I think about 31 Abrams tanks. But this is all coming too late. Only 2 weeks ago, President Biden finally agreed that F-16 modern fighter jets could be given to Ukraine. This will still take some time for those fighter jets to get into the hands of Ukrainian pilots, and for Ukrainian pilots and ground crews to be trained not just to fly these very complex jets, but to maintain them as well. Absolutely. I have got to say that all of these things should have been done earlier, but it is better late than never. So the first imperative is that Ukraine must be helped to win this war and drive Russia off Ukrainian land, because until that happens, and until there are real security guarantees for Ukraine, the reconstruction cannot happen.
I just love the way you answer my questions, dear Mr. Smith. Let us talk about the President of Turkey. The President of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, proposed to create a commission to investigate the destruction of the Kakhovka HPP, and he wants the participation of experts of the warring parties, the UN and the international community, in particular of Turkey. We appreciate what Turkey did for Ukraine, we really do. Some combat units of the Russian Navy are not allowed through the straits within the frame of the Montreux Convention. We appreciate Turkey's contribution to the initiation of that grain initiative operation, participation in the liberation of our Azov regiment warriors from captivity, etc., etc., etc. However, if you, God forbid, could ask me, I'd have to say that any negotiation with Russia just does not make much of a sense to me. Is that right? Well, as an example, it is as a usual approach of the Russians to blast water dams to hinder our counteroffensive. The Russian blasted smaller dams in the Dnipro, river in order to make it full-flowing, thus more damage to be done. They did it in Zaporizhia, blowing up the hydroelectric power stations. I mean, Kremlin is a mill that produces lies, he exactly told us, and Putin is its CEO. All they do, keep on producing proofs of that terrifying aftermath of their invasion of Ukraine. They say it is just not them. Take any of Russian crimes. I mean, the downing of MH17 passenger plane, mass murder of prisoners in Dnipro, Bucha, Alenivka, etc. They keep on lying all the time, always. It's Russian national idea, probably. It wasn't us. I saw that video. Anyway, anyone can easily Google it. If you haven't seen it, I'll tell you the story. Putin is standing in the Kremlin hall, and he's talking to his, I don't know, minions maybe, or officers. He's holding a glass of champagne. And he's like, I don't see any reason in killing civilians and shelling the civilian infrastructure, says Putin. I mean, if I would have a list of my personal top cynical tyrants, this guy would be number one. And it happening all over Ukraine, and people die here every single day. It makes Russia a terrorist led by a thug at large. So my question, is there really a reason to communicate with Kremlin?
I would say at the moment, no. And I would go back to a quote of my good friend Alexei Mikheyev, who said sometime early last year, he said, Ukraine does not need mediators, we need allies. We know that Russia does not negotiate in good faith. We know that Russia has broken virtually every international agreement they have ever signed in relation to Ukraine. Still far too many people, Henry, are not even aware of the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, when Ukraine gave up what was at the time the world's third largest nuclear arsenal, over 4,000 strategic warheads in return for a guarantee of her territorial integrity. And that agreement, that historic agreement, was originally signed by the UK, the United States, and Russia. China and France later signed. Now, in 2014, I believe that the West should have done something far more robust in 2008 when Russia went into Georgia. We did not. Certainly in 2014, when Ukraine's borders were violated both in the east in Donbass and the illegal annexation of Crimea, I'm afraid the West and the UK and the United States in particular, we sat on our hands. I have said we are coming to the party late. We are finally doing this. Will we stick with it? We say we will. I sincerely hope that we will. But I do not see, Russia wants a peace negotiation. Russia wants a ceasefire. Russia is being beaten very, very badly on the ground from all the information we can get. They are fighting against an army which is better trained, better equipped, better led, smarter, and most of all, better motivated, because they are fighting for their homeland and their homes and their wives and husbands and children and their families. And you talked about war crimes. I don't have the exact figure, but the last time I looked up, the Ukrainian prosecutor general, with the full support of the international community, was investigating coming up to 80,000 individual war crimes that have been committed. And I don't really want to go into detail, but you and I know just how barbaric and how horrendous many of those war crimes are, from executions to rapes to tortures to And of course, this most recent one, the destruction of the dam, which is specifically against the Geneva Convention, Article 57, as amended in 1977. That article could have been written specifically for the Kakhovka dam.
I'm with you, but terrible things are happening in Ukraine now at a scale that sometimes people just don't understand it. And I didn't by myself. And when I was in Bucha, and I've seen literally a pit in the ground full of dead bodies, and their hands were tied behind their backs. And I've seen their bullet holes in their napes. Then, when you start to understand that genocide is here now, it's not somewhere else, over there, and it's happening here and now. And I know exactly who's responsible for that.
And as I said, and I'm going to repeat this, Henry, this is not just you and I, as friends of Ukraine, throwing about the word genocide. The United Nations have a charter on genocide. There are 5 tests in that charter.
Passed, yeah.
And if you listen to the great professors, Timothy Snyder out of Yale University, who is, I consider, one of the greatest authorities on Ukraine outside of Ukraine. You know, if you listen to Timothy Snyder, who's an expert on this, explain very, very clearly how Russia has passed all 5 tests. And this goes back to the question, why should we support Ukraine? Because we want to, you and I, we want to live in a civilized world. This is happening in 2023, and people are burying their heads in the sand because it is too much to accept. We want to get on with we want to get on with our lives.
Absolutely.
You know, if I was single, I believe I would be spending my life on the road driving humanitarian supplies. I'm 60, I'm too old to fight. I believe I would be driving humanitarian supplies in and out of Ukraine. My partner will not allow me to do it. And, you know, at 60, I can probably, you know, doing what I do, I satisfy myself that I do the best that I can to give some support.
Stay where you are and do what you do. It really matters for us here in Ukraine. Trust me. Ukraine's accession to NATO is supported by 20 countries of the alliance. Swift and successful adaptation to NATO standards and Western weapons allowed Ukraine to withstand a full-scale Russian invasion. So now it's NATO's turn, and it must adapt to geopolitical turbulence and threats posed by Russia. Ukraine's integration into NATO is the only way to create a security zone for Europe against current and future possible Russian expansion. Ukraine's accession to NATO. Do you think, Cormac, it should happen?
Well, yes, but let me make a couple of points on accession to NATO. I wrote an article. I'll send it to you after this interview, just for interest. It was published on a website of a TV channel here that I do a lot of interviews with. And I basically talked about the 5 great lies which Russia tells and has been developing.
5?
Well, no, the 5 top ones. And one of those top lies, the really important ones, was that the reason for Russia's invasion was because of NATO expansion. And so many people in the West have swallowed this, and I still hear people say, oh, well, you know, we poked the bear and we came far too close up to Russia's borders. Russia has to defend itself. NATO is a defensive alliance. The countries like your country, Latvia, has begged to join NATO. They weren't coerced into it. You've joined NATO for your own security because you know of the threats. Isn't it funny, or isn't it strange, that Russia has never attacked a NATO member? If Ukraine had already been a member of NATO, and I believe personally that, you know, moves should have been taken from 2008 to start bringing Ukraine into NATO. Were Ukraine a member of NATO, this invasion would never have happened. Crimea never would have been illegally annexed, and the Donbass never would have been invaded. I believe that is one of the great Russian lies. Now, clearly, my second point, clearly, there is growing support to take Ukraine into NATO. But clearly, and my belief, and I'm not an expert, but my understanding is that as long as there is an active war happening, that Ukraine will not be taken fully into NATO. So again, we're back to the fact that we must ensure that Ukraine wins this war, and then we must ensure Ukraine's security, and not just Ukraine's security, because quite honestly, and I'm going to tell you a little story in a moment. Quite honestly, I have believed since 1916 that Ukraine fights for all of us. Ukraine is the frontier on the eastern boundary of Europe that is keeping the wolf from all of our door. In 2016, 2017, when I went out at first, and I was working with a group of about 20 ambassadors we were working on how to deal better with the media and how to construct your messages, and we were looking at what were the most important things that all ambassadors across Europe should be saying, so everybody was talking in unison. And I was taken aside by a senior colleague and said, Cormac, the Ukrainians are very, very fond of saying they're fighting for us, they're fighting for the rest of Europe. This does not really go down very well in Western capitals. Maybe you should tell the Ukrainians to stop saying this. Now, that was the reality that I discovered in 2017 because it was too uncomfortable. I think certainly we have moved so far beyond that. And again, and I will always say, although I'm an Irishman, I've lived in Britain for 36 years. I've represented this country as both an athlete and a diplomat in my time in Ukraine, and been very proud to do that. So this is, the United Kingdom is a country that I've had a great life in and I love very much. And I am extremely proud of the leading role that the United Kingdom has played in supporting Ukraine. And my senior diplomat Ukrainian friends have told me over and over, it is not just the weapons that the UK has given to Ukraine, but it is the influence that the United Kingdom has exercised behind the scenes to encourage other countries to support, especially in the early days. But, we should have been doing this before. We're not. We're where we are. So we're back to Ukrainian membership of NATO. It is not in my humble view and in my limited view, because there are people far more experienced than I on this, in my humble view, it is never going to happen as long as the war is in progress. All we can do at the moment is make sure that Ukraine wins that war. As soon as that war is won, Ukraine, in my view, must be taken into NATO and must be taken into the European Union. Ukraine has so much to give Europe and to give the world in terms of a real appreciation of freedom and what freedom really means. We have forgotten, most of us in the West. When Ukrainians talked to me about freedom, it was with an understanding and a visceral nature that I never heard people talking about freedom before. That it's something you can't get from books.
Absolutely.
And this was from the minister I worked for, Pavlo Klimkin down. That it really impressed me. Ukraine has something to give the world. Culturally, economically, Ukraine, when it gets Russia off its neck, can be an economic giant.
Oh, we'll get Russia off our neck, trust us. And we have also our expectations from the world. We in Ukraine are expecting a lot from the Vilnius summit. Polish President Andrzej Duda went last week in Paris alongside French President Emmanuel Macron, and Germany Chancellor Olaf Scholz said people in Ukraine see a light at the end of the tunnel in terms of Russia's invasion. Ukraine seeks to join NATO as quickly as possible, but members of the Western military alliance are divided over how fast that step should be taken. While Eastern European countries want some sort of a roadmap to be offered to Kyiv at the summit in Vilnius, Western members such as the United States, France and Germany are wary of any move that might take the alliance closer to a direct war with Russia.
Ukraine is waiting for a clear signal on a clear perspective for membership in the North Atlantic Alliance. Equally, this is today the greatest expectation for the Ukrainian government, for Ukraine's soldiers, its defenders, and for Ukrainian society. This is unequivocally one of the most important things. I hope that the upcoming NATO summit in Vilnius will bring good news for Kyiv, that Ukraine's future NATO membership is clearly visible, that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, as I am told in Ukraine, which Ukrainians want to see at least when it comes to membership of NATO. It will appear thanks to the decisions we take in Vilnius.
Ukraińcy wreszcie zobaczyć, jeśli chodzi o członkostwo w NATO, pojawi się dzięki naszym decyzjom, które zapadną w Wilnie.
My question is the following. How to convene to the European countries what the Poles and we, as I told you, in the Baltic states, know. This seems to have we understood long ago, and we paid an enormous price for that, being in the Soviet era. How to convene that the Ukraine in NATO is actually a safety guarantee for Europe, at least, if not for the whole world. Maybe not for the whole world, but for the Europe, at least.
You know, Ukraine in NATO will not only give Ukraine more protection. The NATO members must realize that, you know, because of the experience of the last 16 months, the Ukrainian army is the most effective, potent army on the European continent. Man for man, woman for woman. I don't think there is an army on the face of the earth at the moment that could match Ukraine. So Ukraine will bring so much experience and so much leadership and so much resolve and strength to NATO. Ukraine will only strengthen the alliance in the same way as actually a small country, but one of the most impressive countries I have visited, Finland, who were given accession to NATO. That has made, you know, little Finland, 5 million. They can mobilize, I think, 300,000 troops in 24 hours. They have a reserve of 900,000. They have more artillery pieces than France and Germany combined. We do not see Russia attack Finland. We know from our history what happened to Russia in 1938, the last time they attacked Finland. They got a very, very bloody nose out of it. But to go back to Ukraine, look at what Ukraine has done. Yes, Ukraine needs NATO. Ukraine needs NATO for its security. But I have been saying also since 2016, as much, and this was before the war, as much as Ukraine needs the West and the support of the West, we in the West actually need Ukraine. And I believe we need Ukraine for that real value of freedom, which is so alive in all of the people from all walks of life that I met over 2 years. That is something very important, but also for their toughness and their resolve and the strength they will add and the steel that they will put into NATO's spine. What I find far more important is the Ramstein format, where the defense ministers of, I think, 40 countries meet once a month under the chairmanship of Lloyd Austin, the American Secretary of Defense, to decide what armaments Ukraine needs and how they are going to be delivered. But, you know, if I can say something, if I can say one more thing,
please do.
Here's what we got to stop doing. We've got to stop thinking that we in the West can decide what is good for Ukraine and what Ukraine needs. And we need to start listening more to Ukraine and saying, what do you need? And giving Ukraine what she needs. And the people that I would go to next and I've said this already after Ukraine, are yourselves in the Baltics and the Poles and the other countries in the eastern neighborhood who really know what Russia is about. And I'm afraid we are still some way off that position, where rather than deciding as donors how generous we will be, we need to move towards Ukraine and say, no, we need to listen to Ukraine more and give Ukraine what she needs and what she tells us she needs, because it is the Ukrainians who know better than anyone what their day-to-day needs are, both in humanitarian aid, most importantly in terms of military aid, and also reconstruction. If we get past this first step, i.e. we make sure Ukraine wins the war, there will be billions, there will be trillions of dollars available, because there are already large funds and companies lining up who see an opportunity to make an awful lot of money out of the reconstruction of the largest country in Europe that is a sleeping giant.
During the meeting, French President Emmanuel Macron confirmed that a long-anticipated Ukrainian counteroffensive against Russian forces started a few days earlier, and said it had been meticulously planned by military leadership in Kiev.
Yes, the Ukrainian counteroffensive started several days ago. It was planned with care and methodically by military leaders who have shown for a little over a year their determination, their bravery and the excellence of their tactics and organization. And so this offensive is going to take place over several weeks, even several months. We did everything to help it within the limits we have set ourselves from the start of the conflict. Sanction Russia to stop its war effort, help Ukraine resist and regain territory, but never attack Russia and avoid any form of escalation.
Aider l'Ukraine à résister et à reconquérir le territoire.
And now we have a dilemma. Ukrainian armed forces do not tell much about counteroffensive, hardly anything, which is absolutely the right thing to do if you do not want to disclose your counteroffensive plans too early. And of course, Russians and pro-Russian media post loads of disinformation about all these enormous losses and inability of Ukraine to regain territories. Well, then again, of course, they do. They are Ukrainian enemies. We expect nothing else. They try to persuade the world that Ukraine needs them, negotiations with the Russian Federation. Can you please advise our audience, not the professionals, but our people that are watching us right now, what is the best communication strategy to resist Kremlin lies, and where and how one can find the truth about what is happening really in the world and in Ukraine?
Well, I go back to an article that I wrote only yesterday when I talked about I talked about the 5 great lies that Russia tells. But, we have got to, back in 2017, I wanted to conduct an international campaign that was basically, the title of the campaign would have been Russia Lies on an Industrial Scale. And many people in many countries in the West thought that we could not use language like this because it would offend Russia. So finally, we need to educate our viewers and our audiences and ordinary men and women in the street. People must understand the very nature of Russian disinformation. So we must know that anything that Russia says at the moment about the counteroffensive can have absolutely no credibility. And it's only through people. This is what, I studied the way Sweden and Finland in particular dealt with Russian disinformation when I was in Ukraine from 2016 to 2018. And I believe that Sweden and Finland were 2 of the leading countries in dealing with disinformation. And the one common thing that I learned about how Finland and Sweden dealt with disinformation was education early on to build resilience. And by resilience, they meant resistance to lies, to actually know, well, if Russia is saying it, it probably has no credibility. So that's the first and most important thing. The second thing is to absolutely accept, I'm sure you've seen it, the Ukraine's Ministry of Defense under the great Alexei Reznikov put out a film about a week and a half ago where they had a whole lot of soldiers going, shush. They wanted silence. Don't talk about it. You know, during the Second World War, there was a saying in Britain, loose lips sink ships. Britain engaged in many great deceptions to fool the Germans. Russia engages, all armies engage in deception. The Russians have a name for it. It is, I can't think of the name at the moment. The only thing I would say, Ukraine will also engage in deception. The only thing that I would say, my money is on Ukraine, because the Ukrainian armed forces and leadership have so far shown themselves to be a lot more intelligent and a lot smarter than their Russian counterparts. So I think we have got to accept there are far too many people, for example, online, armchair generals, I call them, coming out with all sorts of theories of what's happening and so forth. I don't think this is helpful. It adds to the confusion. I have actually turned down a number of interview requests in the last few weeks because I said I will not speculate. I do not know and I will not speculate. I do not believe it is helpful. So two things. I think we must help people to understand, you know, and to give them the example of the great lies. Ukraine is full of Nazis. No, it's not. The 2013-2014 Revolution of Dignity, the Maidan Revolution, was an American-backed coup to bring down a democratically elected president, Yanukovych. No, it was not. It was Europe's last great popular, spontaneous revolution. I spoke to hundreds and hundreds of people who stood on Maidan every night. I spoke to an old man who'd been a colonel in the Soviet army and fought in Afghanistan, who stood on the Maidan in temperatures of -20 with his wife in her 70s. These people became friends. They were parents of a colleague of mine. And they were on the Maidan when people were being shot. And in their 70s, they would not take a step back.
Well,
so, you know, these are the great lies. And also, you know, Ukraine commits genocide against the Russian-speaking minority. No, I'll tell you where genocide was committed. The great city of Mariupol, a Russian-speaking city, and a city that politically tended to lean towards, you will know this better than I, tended to lean towards more Russia-sympathetic political parties, right? That city had a population of 500,000. The mayor of Mariupol, we will never know, has estimated that over 100,000 citizens died in the first 3 months of the Russian invasion. The Nazis killed 20,000 in the 1940s. In 2 years, Russia has likely killed 100,000. That's a genocide of the Russian-speaking people. These are the great lies which Russia tells, which I have had to deal with sometimes in television debates, which I have seen supposedly intelligent people come out with. Useful idiots. So we must do more. You know, yourselves who have a voice and a platform, all of us, we must help people to understand the nature of how Russia operates and how they weaponize information and they use lies as weapons, and how they have been spending hundreds of millions on this certainly since the formation of Russia Today in 2005, and it really escalated with the annexation of Crimea in 2014. And this is open to everyone. It's open source information. Google Gerasimov doctrine. Gerasimov, I don't know whether he's been sacked or whether he's still in place at the moment because the generals changed so much, but Gerasimov was at one stage the chief of staff of the Russian armed forces. He is credited more than anybody else with putting together the Russia's hybrid war strategy based on lying on an industrial scale. People have got to understand this. There is no point. Once a lie is out there, we can't bring it back. People must realize when they hear the lie first, they don't believe it. That is the first thing. And secondly, those of us on our side, we must accept and we must trust in the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian armed forces, and we must not speculate. It's very hard, but speculation is not helpful.
Thank you very much, Cormac, for your answer. I just love the way and your position. But do you think the governments of our partners' country know the exact figures of our losses? Do you think that they can even imagine how many people we've lost? Civilians and our heroes at the front lines just as well.
Look, I can't believe that British intelligence, American intelligence, the governments of the Baltic countries, I cannot believe that they have not got a very good idea. Ukraine, from the very start, as you know, has published every day. The Ministry of Defense has published a tally of enemy losses. I think Ukraine will put these figures out to try and build morale among the Ukrainian people. I am not saying for a moment I do not believe them, but actually I don't think it's the most important thing. I'll tell you what the most important thing is. I'm working at the moment with the mayor of a small city in Western Ukraine. And I had a meeting by Zoom with him yesterday. I'm trying to do some stuff to build links with local government in Ukraine and local government in the United Kingdom. And the first meeting I had with Volodymyr, and this is a big, tough guy with a big reputation. He is a war veteran. He fought in 2014 and 2015. And he tells me that he has his army pack and his gun by his door, ready to go anytime he is called up. But in the meantime, he is the mayor of his city. He does humanitarian work to the front, and he travels around the world trying to get support for Ukraine. But the first time I spoke to him, and it was as if we were in the same room, he looked into my eyes, Cormac, he said, we are losing so many and we are losing our best. And he almost broke down in tears. And he said, it's not like Russia that we empty our prisons and Russia doesn't care about. Russia clearly does not care. Putin does not care about how many of his own people he throws into the meat grinder. We know, you and I know from living among you for 2 years, that Ukraine cares about its own people. And when Volodymyr looked into my eyes and he said, Cormac, we are losing thousands and we are losing our best. And there is how much can Ukraine bear? Well, I looked at a very recent survey that said, I think 84% of the Ukrainian people said they would keep fighting and they would not back any concession of land for peace.
Absolutely.
Because of course, we know that in every single settlement Ukraine's armed forces liberate, they find the same abominable pattern of war crimes and abuse that were found in Bucha after the Battle of Kyiv was won. So abandoning fellow citizens to the butchery and the barbarism of Russia is simply not acceptable. I don't think Volodymyr Zelensky could sue for peace at the moment. I don't think the Ukrainian people would allow him. And as a leader, I believe he is very well reflecting the will of the people who he was chosen to lead at this very difficult point in history.
Well, it is clear to me. It is clear to you. I am in Ukraine. You've been to Ukraine. You know all the ins and outs. But what about the Western audience? Like the Russian propaganda wires has been cut. And like no Sputnik anymore and no RTI and everything. And what are the sources of truth for these audiences in the West?
Well, they are first, look, the media, even in my lifetime and in recent years has become an awful lot more complex. So if you look at Russia, it's very easy for the Kremlin to have great information control because television in Russia is massively influential. In the West, we have a far greater multitude of channels. The mainstream media, however, is still very, very influential. And, we need to look at how, social media and the various channels is also influential. And very often, social media reflects what is in the mainstream media, certainly in the West. And in work that I did in the British Cabinet Office back in 2018, when I was advising on Russian disinformation and we were dealing with the aftermath of the attempted murder of Sergei Skripal and his daughter in Salisbury, we looked very, very carefully at Russian disinformation and how the media and social media were consuming this. One of the things that we found in 2018 was that the Kremlin, but this was a dedicated unit in the UK Foreign Office, the Kremlin put out no less than 47 different false narratives to explain the attempted murder of Sergei Skripal. These ranged from Theresa May, the then Prime Minister, did it, the CIA did it, the mother-in-law did it. There was even a story. The UK chemical weapons research facility, Porton Down, is actually situated very close to the city of Salisbury. And one story was the Novichok simply blew in on the wind from Porton Down. This was how it happened. 47 false narratives, each one more ridiculous than the last. And what we did, we monitored the media very closely. And what I've got to tell you we found was that despite the amount of traffic and the amount of noise on social media, where the big influence was still coming was the mainstream media and the main news channels of BBC, of ITV, of Channel 4, of Channel 5. These were the ones that were really influential. And in fact, in terms of that information battle, and I was a very small part of it as an advisor when I came back from Ukraine, but the British government very much won that information battle because I think we established that well over 80% of the UK population accepted the British government narrative, which was obviously the narrative of the Ukrainian government and the other allies and everybody who was very, very clear from early on that this assassination was carried out by GRU agents. But it's about, I think that brings us back to the mainstream media is still important. It's not the channels in communication are important. What's important in communication is leadership.
Just leadership.
And, it's the little people like me up to the big people like Volodymyr Zelensky and everybody in between who is telling the same story. And one of the conversations I used to have when I was in Ukraine, because, I was a special communication advisor to the foreign minister, but in my time, I ended up working with 4 other cabinet ministers and 5 ministries. And one of the conversations that I used to have with some very bright, good people was, but look, Cormac, if Russia is doing this, we should do it back, i.e., if they're using disinformation, we should use disinformation against them. And I always argued very clearly, no, we have got to keep the moral high ground. We have got to convince the world that we are, in as far as possible, we are truthful, that what we tell is the truth, because otherwise what Russia wants, Russia, remember, does not fight for truth. Russia does not fight for any one truth. They use what they call a fire hose, what we in the West, in the UK government, call a fire hose of falsehoods. So many different stories, like 47 false narratives, that you just confuse everyone so nobody knows what to believe, so they believe nobody. I think over the last 2 years, I think since the start of this war, I think a lot of people's eyes have opened. I think people and I'm talking about right up to the top levels of government, I think people are now far more aware of the nature of how Russia conducts diplomacy and how Russia lies. I told you I was in a meeting in Vilnius in 2018, and a German diplomat and a French diplomat, I was pushing very, very hard to get everybody to cooperate on a pan-European communication campaign that would basically tell people that Russia lies on an industrial scale. That phrase, which I keep using over and over again, Pavlo Klimkin used it. I use it over and over again still. And I was told by several colleagues around the table, we cannot use language like that. That will offend Russia. We must keep talking to Russia. That was 2018. I think we have moved in most European capitals, maybe with the exception of Hungary. I think we have moved far, far beyond that. The scales have fallen from people's eyes. People have no choice but to realize what we are dealing with. But still, the problem with democracy is you've got to get everybody to agree with you. Everybody has a say. So, there are 27 member states to the EU. There are how many? Help me out. I think 30 member nations in NATO.
If I'm not mistaken, I believe so.
Yeah. So, getting all these people on the one page is a very, very big challenge, because we are dealing with democracies. And this is where I come back to the fact that Russia uses our democratic values against us. Now, I think we have all seen far greater, I think Putin and the Russians will have been surprised and shocked by the amount of cohesion and unity that they have seen from NATO and the European Union and some other allies in the West as well. We have, I believe, come a long, long way. So, an independent commentator like me, and I'm not a civil servant anymore, I couldn't do this if I was. I can speak exactly as I wish. I put my own rules on myself. My first rule is I will do my best to be informative but honest at the same time. Because if I'm not honest, and if I start purveying lies that I think might help Ukraine, I ultimately lose credibility and I'm no better than Russia. My second rule is that on every opportunity I will bust Russian lies. And my third one is I will put my hands up and say, look, I'm not neutral. I'm a friend of Ukraine. My job, and the reason I do this, is to advocate for Ukraine and to try and explain to people. But I will do that honestly. So I think we have made real progress. But I think we need to, it's very easy for me, sitting in my office, my home office in London, to say, arm Ukraine to the teeth, sanction Russia back to the Stone Age. And I've been saying that for 16 months. But I also recognize, from my time as a senior civil servant and a diplomat, and from my life experience, that the reality of getting 30 major democratic nations to come together, and all of those leaders are looking over their shoulder at the next election, this is really hard. Putin does not deal with that. He's a dictator. He's an autocrat. He has absolute power. So in a way, this is a handicap that we deal with, but we will keep dealing with it because it's the price we pay for our democracies and our freedom. But I think it's important to realize, I don't want to sound like I'm just criticizing America and my own government and every other government for not doing enough. I don't think we've done enough soon enough. I think we have done it earlier, but I think we also need to be realistic and understand just how hard it is to get that unity among up to 30 democracies.
The war helped. Don't get me wrong. It's a terror. It's awful. But all Putin plans have gone wrong. He said that he feared of NATO. Now he must be fearing of Ukraine. What is the point of this? What do you think could be the point now to continue this war for the Kremlin? I mean, everything is falling apart.
Look, Putin's only concern is himself and his own position, his own wealth, and his own safety.
Power.
What Putin, I've said already, and you know, Henry, what Putin fears most is the Russian people. It's what any Russian leader in history fears most is the Russian people. And is he losing his grip on the Russian people? Are there cracks appearing in the Kremlin regime? Has he got opposition from Kadyrov or from Prigozhin or from others that we maybe don't know of? Well, we can only hope, but I am not going to be the one to jump to those conclusions and say, as somebody put out a report which got thousands of retweets, that Shoigu had issued a command to shoot all Wagner members, including Prigozhin, on sight. And somebody sent this to me, a former diplomat has sent this to me and said, have you seen this? And I said, well, I don't believe it. Where's the source? And I did a bit of digging around, and somebody came back and said, this guy has form of making stuff up just to get the clicks, just to get the, so this is dangerous. So no, every time I hear that Putin has problems with his health, every time I hear that Putin is under pressure, in the back of my mind, I think, I hope so, but am I going to bank on it? No, I don't think it's something we can bank on at all. I think Putin has an absolute iron grip on the Russian people and on the machinery of the Russian state. One thing I learned from sport, I used to be a competitive athlete in my younger years. And in sport, whether you're playing rugby or I was a javelin thrower, or I was believe it or not, I was an international bobslayer at World Cup level. And the one thing you do is you don't spend all your time worrying about your opposition, because you can't really change what they do unless you want to break the rules and sabotage their equipment or something. You can't. You've just got to focus on your own game, and I think that's what Ukraine has to do, and what Ukraine is doing. And those of us who are friends of Ukraine, who do what little we can and I try and fight in the information space, because this is an information war. And I try and honestly convince people of the truth and make people understand how Russia lies. But actually, we need to just focus on what we can do best. I believe the stronger we are with Russia, the more they will back down. But more importantly, I think this applies even more so to China. And China is watching. And if we were to allow Russia succeed in Ukraine, this gives great encouragement to China's ambition with Taiwan. It also gives great encouragement to China, say, well, it looks like it's safe for us to go in and to go all in our support of Russia, because when it comes right down to it, the West will do so much, but they back off. They're afraid of the fight. So I really, really believe that the answer to this is absolute commitment and strength by the Western alliance, by all of us. I see no other way out of it, because the only other way out of it is backing down to a bully, and that never ends well. We're not going to be left alone in my beautiful home in central London and my wonderful life. I'm not going to be left alone. This wolf will come to our door if it's not stopped. And I go back to something, and it was very poignant. In December of 2021, Alexei Reznikov, about the 21st, just before Christmas, I think it was about the 21st of December, Alexei Reznikov, for viewers, Ukraine's Minister of Defense, was interviewed by CNN, and he said very clearly, he said, we do not expect or want your boots on the ground. Just give us the weapons we need, and we will do our own fighting. That was 2 months before Russia further invaded. By God, how much more do the Ukrainian people need to prove to us how they can fight and how resilient they are? We cannot, and this is, I'm talking to every man, woman, and child across Europe who may listen to this. How can we let the Ukrainian people down? If you don't, and if somebody out there doesn't have the heart and the moral compass for this,
absolutely,
look to your own self-interest, because this wolf will come to your door.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your answer and for your position again and again. It was lovely conversation with Mr. Cormac Smith, the expert indeed in the fields of government communication, the first episode. In the second episode, you can expect us talking about sanctions and what awaits for those countries on the Kremlin side. Stay safe and tuned for more.